Hi everyone, welcome back to Shinto Foundations, Festivals, and Fox Shrines. This week we're going to be talking about Kami and Buddha interactions, and if you're wondering what I mean by that term, you will find out shortly. So the obvious question in a Shinto class is, what's Buddhism got to do with it? And the answer is actually quite a lot, as we will see. So this brings up the question of syncretism. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this term, but essentially it means the merging or amalgamation of different religions, cultures, schools of thought. And it's quite relevant here because there is a long history of syncretism between Buddhism and Shinto in Japan. Now, if this surprises you, that's not too surprising to me, partially because this has been largely erased from, ideas of Shinto in particular. Modern efforts and movements to separate Shinto and Buddhism have had a profound effect on the history of Shinto as a whole. Most notably, you may know the term state Shinto. That refers to Shinto as it was practiced and managed by the government under imperial Japan, right? When Japan in the modern period was, obviously modernizing, but also trying to expand its control. Shinto was a big part of that, and it was very much controlled by the government. And because it was relatively nationalistic, it was trying to get rid of all of these foreign influences, of which Buddhism was perceived as one. If you want to know more about this, don't worry, we'll be discussing it in week 7. But for now, what's important is the reason this history hasn't been revived, since state Shinto is no longer a thing, is partially because acknowledging the role of Buddhism in the development of Shinto, and that the two shared so much for so long, really disturbs the idea of Shinto as an indigenous religion, which is one thing a lot of Shinto priests and others present, and also that it's a timeless tradition that has been in effect for so long. So a good example of this is the quote you see here, talking about first that Shinto is the indigenous faith of the Japanese people. It's more than a religion. It encompasses ideas, attitudes, ways of doing things, and has become an integral part of the Japanese people for the better part of 2,000 years. This is a quote from the website of the Jinja Honcho, the Association of Shinto Shrines, in their section on what is Shinto. And this is how they're presenting Shinto, again, as indigenous, as having a super long history. And in a way it does. Certainly the worship of Kami does, but Shinto as an organized religion, not so much. And also, again, it benefited quite a lot from continental influences, including Buddhism. So let's see how that works. So first we're going to talk about how deities were synchronized. I think this is a good way to enter into how syncretism works, and especially as we've been thinking a lot about Kami, now is a great time to investigate how Kami sort of functioned and were imagined when Buddhism and Shinto were so intertwined. So it's worth bringing up first that Buddhas, when Buddhism came to Japan, Buddhas were seen essentially as foreign kami. And this makes a lot of sense, right? If you don't know what a Buddha is and you already have deities, why not consider them to be like the deities you already have? This didn't last too long, however. You soon start to see an idea, especially as Buddhism gains ground, that kami are, like all other sentient beings, in need of salvation. They need Buddhism to help them reach enlightenment. And again, this makes sense if you remember that kami can be both benevolent or malevolent, right? And the malevolent aspect often tends to be a problem. So one thing that Buddhism offers is that it can pacify the kami. It can keep them from being too destructive. And so once that takes hold, you see structurally a growth in what is often translated as shrine temples, and that's literally what it means if you look at Jingu plus G. And these are temples on shrine grounds that are, right near, theoretically, the home of the kami, and are there to pray for the kami's enlightenment. Somewhat later on, but still pretty much the same time. We do have to remember that this isn't, exactly, we don't have very clear stages here. We do have changes, but they're not necessarily happening one after another. So around the same time, you see a new idea that the kami are protectors of the Dharma. Right? This is something that other deities, particularly Hindu deities, had also played a role in Buddhism, because Buddhas can't really be violent, right? And that also means they can't necessarily defend themselves. So what you see here is Buddhism sort of harnessing, rather than just pacifying the kami and their ability to be violent, they're harnessing it in order to protect themselves. Protect the Buddhas, protect the Dharma. Occasionally, even Buddhist temples would, threaten other temples or the state with the power of the kami associated with them, because again, the kami can be violent in a way the Buddhas can't necessarily. So again, this has an effect structurally. You start to see, instead of shrine temples, temple shrines. I know this gets a little confusing, but you can think about the, whatever the first word is being the major things. So now you have protective shrines on the grounds of temples, hence the term temple shrines. And that's what you're seeing here in terms of this Tamuki Hachimangu, so Hachiman, kami, gu being a shrine, but this is a particular shrine called a Chinjusha, which is on the grounds of the temple. So this, if we think about Hachiman's role that you read about in Bernard Scheid's article, that he helped, sort of gather the bronze needed to cast the great Buddha at the temple Todaiji, he's later installed in a Chinjusha on the temple grounds, which still exists today, although now it's independent of Todaiji, and of course it's been rebuilt many times. So as it reaches the medieval period, you have a few different ways of thinking about kami and Buddhas and their relationships. One of the first is to consider kami as local manifestations of Indian deities, really, again, Buddhist deities. So this is where the term Honji Suijaku comes into play, and that's a major part of the article, the book chapter you read by Breen and Rambelli, Taewin and Rambelli, excuse me. So Honji Suijaku literally means trace manifestations of original ground. The trace manifestations are the kami, and the original ground are the Buddhist deities. So this turns into, at first it's sort of a few associations here and there, but by the medieval period, it really gets to be systematic in the fact that pretty much every major kami is paired with a Buddhist deity and considered, again, to be the local version of that deity. So a good example of this is Amaterasu, the sun goddess, is paired with, and again imagined to be the local version of Mahavairochana, the cosmic Buddha, who you see in this picture here. The great Buddha at Todaiji Temple, which we just talked about, is indeed Mahavairochana. And he's often pictured to be in front of the sun, right, as the cosmic Buddha radiating his light. So that's a natural pairing with Amaterasu, the sun goddess. Later on, you see the reverse idea that Buddhas are instead manifestations of kami, and so that makes the kami the original ground, and Buddhas and other deities just the local manifestations of those kami. So this, understandably, is called Han Honji Suijaku, or reverse Honji Suijaku, reversing which deity is considered to be the original. And this coincides with the rise of organized Shinto schools. Again, this is something we'll be talking about quite soon, next week, but just to give you a sense of how this shifts, and that's partially due to shifting ideas of Japan and its importance on the global stage, if you will. So early on, it's thought that Japan was not as good as other countries because Buddhism came so late, and Japan was so far from India, the heart of Buddhism. Later on, you get this idea that instead, no, Japan is sort of the heart of the world and where the true deities reside. Okay, so this brings us into thinking about deities themselves a little more closely, and I want to go over a bunch of the terms for deities just so you're familiar with them, especially as you're considering kami a little more closely. So kami, of course, you know quite well what kami is and what it can be, but I just want to note the fact that in kami names, a lot of times you find suffixes either as no kami, again, like the kami of something, or, the name of a kami, or the suffix shin, right? That's the same shin we have in Shinto. You also have a term called gongen, which is an avatar. So, an avatar is originally an idea from Hinduism and literally meant descent, the idea that deities descend in very often human form onto earth, but more broadly interpreted as the incarnations of various deities. And one example of this, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who founded the Tokugawa shogunate that gave name to the Tokugawa period, is often considered to be a gongen, right? A Buddhist deity who took human form in order to help Japan. In this case, he did, finally bring peace to Japan after 150 years of warfare. So somewhat merited, perhaps. Another term you'll see is myojin, literally bright deity, and that refers to a kami who is radiating the light of the Dharma. So yet again, a kami who is in service of Buddhism. And just a note that for any of these terms, whether kami, you'll see o kami, or in case of the other terms, dai gongen or dai myojin, that's all the same character and it just means great. So that's where you'll occasionally again see translation of the great bright deity so-and-so, or the great avatar so-and-so. And turning over to Buddhism again, just so you're familiar with the terms, for Buddha there's two terms, hotoke when by itself, and then butsu often added to a deity's name. So for instance, the Buddha Amitabha, who's sort of the center of Pure Land Buddhism, is called Amida Butsu. Another term that is perhaps even more important for you to be familiar with is bosatsu. That's the Sanskrit word is bodhisattva, and that's a concept in Mahayana Buddhism, the most common form of Buddhism in Japan. And this is essentially a Buddhist deity who postpones enlightenment in order to save other sentient beings. Compassion is a key concept in Mahayana, and these bodhisattvas are essentially the embodiment of compassion, and sometimes they're translated or thought of as Buddhist saints, and I think there is merit to that correlation. So you'll be getting familiar with one particular bodhisattva during your video this week, Kannon, otherwise known as Guanyin or Guanyin in China and Korea respectively, but she's probably the most popular bodhisattva in all of East Asia if we had to pick one. And another great example is the picture you see on your right here. You also have Hachiman, who is, a kami at first at least, so Hachiman no kami or Hachiman Shin, as he's described in this picture here, but is also called Hachiman Daibosatsu, the great bodhisattva Hachiman, because as you'll find from your readings, Hachiman is in some ways one of the most syncretic deities out there. He's one of the only ones who's very often pictured in monks' attire and, with the shaven tonsure as you see here. Okay, so what is my point in all of this? As you see here, that Shinto and Buddhism were tight. They were really integrated in various ways. They interacted in various ways in pre-modern Japan. So on the one hand, you see this architecturally in terms of shrine, temple, and temple-shrine complexes. This also affects a lot of people because you see correlations and partnerships between shrine and temple priests. If you had a shrine-temple complex, it was not particularly unusual that one branch of the family is in charge of the shrine and one branch of the family is in charge of the temple. If it's a fairly small complex, maybe it's even the same family. Sometimes there were indeed hierarchies with the temple priests being more valuable or better paid than the shrine priests or vice versa, but very clear connections and partnerships between them. And as you've seen already, this also extends to deities, whether the deities were, matched and considered to be, essentially the same entity, just the local manifestation, as we saw in Honji Suijaku. In other cases, you just see a, particular kami installed as a protector deity. A lot of ways that these deities worked together, if you will. And this really brings us to a super important point, which is that Buddhism came to Japan as an organized religion, which Shinto was not at that point. So Buddhism has the sutras, sacred texts, quite a lot of them, in fact. Buddhism has ethical codes, both the Vinaya, which are the codes for monks and nuns, but also, ethical systems for lay people. They have a pantheon of coordinated deities, even somewhat ranked deities, right? You already have the distinction between Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and there are a lot more we could go into, but this isn't a class on Buddhism, so I'm not going to. But just to, think about this, because yet another thing you see is the fact that Buddhism, even though there are a lot of different sects, there are different schools, but they have clear hierarchies and a clear way of organizing each sect and school, and also ways for the different sects to communicate and, exchange ideas and priests and whatnot with one another. So kami worship, which is one way we might talk about Shinto before it's formalized, adapts and borrows from continental examples in various ways. So early on, if we think back to last week, we have the Jingi cult, which separated kami into, again, categories and hierarchies based on heavenly and earthly. We also see this in the Kojiki Nihon Shoki, but some of those concepts, especially when applied to actual practice, were taken from Confucian principles and ideas. Later on, and again we'll get to this next week, organized Shinto develops from Buddhist examples, both in terms of how their texts are organized, how the schools themselves are organized, and in terms of developing Shinto into some sort of cohesive, organized school. The Buddhist examples were there, and they used them. So again, just showing that Shinto really does take quite a lot from Buddhism specifically, but from continental examples and precedents more generally. And it is important to emphasize yet again that regional differentiation remains. Even once we have Shinto schools, that doesn't mean we have one unified set of Shinto. That really doesn't happen until the modern period. You still have individual shrines acting independently of Buddhist temples, independently of the court or the central government, just, sort of keeping up their localized practices. All right, so this is a perfect time to talk about your second project, Kami Kaleidoscope, I'm calling it. Yet again, the alliteration, I'm sorry. So this is in form quite similar to your first project, except that you are picking, instead of a shrine, you're picking a kami this time. And unlike last time, I will allow some repetition for the major deities, if people are interested. So yet again, pick a kami, email me your choice by April 27th, and then explore the, okay, that should really be kami. So I'll fix it in the slides, but you know what I'm talking about. So first you're going to look at the mythology and folklore, right? In many cases, your kami will come from the Kojiki Nihon Shoki, but even if they don't, there will be local stories that you can draw from. What's the area of specialization of your kami? Are they a kami of a particular thing? Usually multiple things, and those particular areas of interest may have changed over the years. Thinking about the shrines, where is your kami enshrined? How many shrines? Distribution, are these shrines centered in a particular area? Are they all over Japan? Are there any distinguishing features of those shrines and how they appear? The history of your kami, again, the origins, whether they come from very early text or not, whether there have been any shifts in meaning or in popularity. Some kami were relatively poorly known at first and then became popular in later periods. So that's an important thing to consider. And lastly, performance. And I mean this in a few different ways. Do your kami appear in kagura, or are kagura, again, the sacred dances performed for them? How do they function in matsuri? Are they brought out in a mikoshi, or are they just celebrated in various ways? Again, how does performance play into the ideas surrounding this particular kami? Some kami, again, are thought to have originated forms of performance as well. So bear that in mind, depending on which kami you choose. So this is again another short project. It's due on May 8th. As before, it should be around 1,000 words. The format is flexible, especially after seeing some of your peers' presentations this past week. Hopefully you have new ideas about how you could do the project. And as before, it could be collaborative. So do bear that in mind. Okay, materials for the week I'm going to go over very briefly. So for today, you have an article by Bernard Scheid on Shomuteno and the deity from Kyushu. Spoiler alert, it's Hachiman. You also have a video about, also still from NHK World, but this time about Kanon, again, a bodhisattva. Why a bodhisattva? Partially so you get some exposure to Buddhism in Japan, but also how ideas of kami influence the portrayal of this very popular bodhisattva. For Wednesday, Thursday, you have another half oh no, this isn't a chapter, but this is half of a very long introduction that talks about, again, the various stages and how kami and Buddhas were correlated. And finally, on Friday, you have another half chapter from A New History of Shinto, talking about a particular shrine. I know the page numbers are a little different than the page numbers I have in my book, so just read until this particular subheading, the Hiei Shrines in Early Modern Japan. Finally, some discussion questions. One is a pretty general one. What patterns of syncretism most intrigue you or confuse you? Why or why not? What draws you to these? Thinking about the Taewon and Rambelli reading, again, that's all about the patterns of syncretism between kami and Buddhas. Pick a specific example to discuss. How was the kami in this example portrayed and why? Finally, in the Breen and Taewon reading, again, A New History of Shinto, one of our textbook. The half chapter you're reading is all about Hiei Shrine, and the history of Hiei Shrine is long and super complicated. So let's think first about when was the power of Hiei at its height. This may be more than once, but when was Hiei as a shrine doing very well? And then think back to your shrine for Project 1. Does it have a syncretic past? Quite honestly, almost certainly. If it's older than right around 1860, which 1868 is considered the beginning of modernization in Japan, it has a syncretic past. How easily you can find out about it is one question, but it's definitely worth thinking about and looking for. Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you in class discussion on either Wednesday or Thursday. Remember, you have both options. Thanks.